Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, as calls grow across Africa for heavy-handed policing to be reined in, we speak to International Alert about what should change and what can change in the fraught and sometimes fatal relationship between security forces and civilians. Also, South Africa is bracing to face its deepest slump in almost a century. The economy is expected to contract by over 7%. And as Gabon decriminalizes gay sexual relations, homosexuality remains illegal in dozens of other African countries. Some LGBTQ members who've fled to Kenya in the hopes of living as their authentic selves find that acceptance there is still a struggle. But first, this week, a Kenyan policeman enforcing the country's coronavirus curfew was charged with murdering a 13-year-old boy. At least 7 people were killed in the first 5 nights of the restrictions brought in Kenya from March. Complaints about the heavy-handed response of police in imposing emergency measures have stacked up since the start of the pandemic. As debate about police brutalities gathered momentum following the killing of an unarmed man in the United States in May, many African communities have added their voices to calls for police responses to be re-examined. Earlier, I spoke to Cindy Chungong, the Africa Program Director at International Alert, and I asked her why the coronavirus pandemic appears to have led to so many incidents of police abuse.
I would say that despite the warnings from the virus trends in Asia and Europe, many lockdown measures in Africa were imposed with very little warning and on a scale that's never been seen before. And security forces, particularly the police, were immediately deployed to ensure that these measures were respected. But in many cases, they were not equipped to deal with this level of work. They're not properly trained in community engagement and with dealing with people who have been made even more vulnerable socially and economically by lockdown. So what we've seen is a blunt tool of force being used to deal with economic and social problems. And in many of these countries, a legacy of abuses means that for many people, the sight of security forces patrolling the streets doesn't bring a sense of calm, but rather a deep fear. And we know that interactions based on fear and distrust will often lead to violence. And then finally, there's been little oversight of the process of lockdown and unclear communication about the rules, which leaves the door open for impunity and abuse, especially among security forces that are used to a lack of accountability in the way that they operate.
So it's not just about lockdown. You believe that the friction that we've seen between police and the communities that they serve could and should have been anticipated?
Yes, because what we're seeing is fundamentally a manifestation of a lack of trust and accountability between citizens and state. So what the coronavirus pandemic has done has exposed and exacerbated, yes, those underlying conditions. This is not the first time in most of these countries that we're seeing excessive use of force by security forces. And while the context in each country may be different, in most cases, there's been a long-standing deficit of trust in public institutions and a lack of accountability from security forces in particular at normal times. So what we're seeing now is a more extreme manifestation of what has been happening for a very long time.
So what needs to change and what do you think can change in terms of improving the relationships between civilians and police across Africa?
I think that we fundamentally need to reconceptualize the role of the security forces, and particularly those who are in positions of direct and regular interaction with citizens like the police. And we need to move away from a vision of the police as a punitive force and more towards one of them as a community resource. That's not to say that they don't have a role to play in sanctioning crime and violence, but that if we see their role through that as a primary lens, we're setting up an antagonistic relationship with them and the communities they're meant to serve. So what this means is that we have to push not just for laws to be created and enforced to sanction bad behavior from the security forces, which is absolutely necessary, but we have to create systems that prevent that from happening in the first place. And that means creating avenues for citizens to be more involved in decision-making and oversight of security forces. And one thing that we've done towards Alert is really promote a model of community policing that brings the security forces closer to communities to understand the specific context that they work in and the root causes of the conflicts, crime, and violence that they are trying to deal with, and to have a more proactive and collaborative approach and not a reactive and punitive one. And that's some of the work that we've done in Mali and Nigeria, for example, and we've seen some of the fruits of these in communities where we've worked, where security forces that we've worked in with have played a supportive rather than abusive role to communities in lockdown. And finally, I want to say there's a need to invest more broadly in social and governance services and peace-building approaches to address holistically the problems that generate conflicts, crime, and instability. Too often, the police and security forces are the sole government representatives, and they're expected to play roles which they're simply not equipped to do. So there needs to be a greater investment in other services that allow people to live dignified lives.
Cindy Chungong there eloquently speaking to me a little earlier on. Well, South Africa is bracing to face its deepest slump in almost a century. The economy is expected to contract by over 7%. Bad news for one of the continent's biggest hitters, and the stresses of the coronavirus pandemic are not all to blame. Nicolas Chemin has more.
Last year, before the coronavirus, South Africa's economy had slipped into recession. The pandemic has only made the situation worse. The economy is expected to shrink by more than 7%, the largest contraction in 90 years. On Wednesday, the government said public debt is projected to be more than 3/4 of GDP.
Our Herculean task is to close the mouth of the hippopotamus, that gap between revenue and the ever-increasing expenditure. This hippo is eating our children's inheritance.
A strict lockdown began on March the 27th and lasted for more than a month. It closed down the economy. On Tuesday, the unemployment rate hit a record high of 30%. Many employees are being told they'll have to work less.
We are going to look at 1 week in or 1 week off, but that's how we are going to work. And it has been communicated to all the staff members to make sure that they understand the impact that the virus has had across the economy.
President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a massive relief package in April, but no significant help was offered to the informal sector, which, according to the World Bank, provides employment to 1/4 of all South Africans.
Well, Nigerian doctors suspended a strike over safety and pay this week. They've said that they've been badly treated by the government during a time of crisis, and that beyond that, their field's not been supported enough. So they've backed down from industrial action for now, but have warned it's just a temporary reprieve. Our correspondents report.
Ruth Oku treasures every moment she gets to spend with her family. They help her forget the pressures she faces as a resident doctor. The dermatologist works in Lagos and is disillusioned by the health system. She's trying to resist the urge to relocate from Nigeria.
I don't regret not taking whatever options that had come my way before now. Yes, it's sad looking back that, maybe things would have been better for me. Okay, I may not have to be out here struggling so much.
Regardless of which party is in power, Nigeria's health infrastructure has been left underfinanced. Doctors complain that they are neglected. This has led to the loss of precious human capital as many leave to practice in North America and or Europe.
Even as the pandemic is going on, people are still traveling in spite of the lockdown. Some of us experts are still going abroad to work.
This human capital flight is a major problem as the country struggles to get a grip on coronavirus. Over 20,000 people have tested positive for COVID-19. The National Association of Resident Doctors plan on keeping up the pressure in their push for better working conditions and better salaries.
The fight is not even for this generation, but it's also for generation coming after us, because residency has a designated time. After residency, you become a consultant. But what of the people coming after you? Must we wait for things to continue like this?
For now, the ball is in the government's court. But the Resident Doctors Union has vowed to go back on strike if they are not satisfied with the progress of negotiations.
Gabon has decriminalized gay sexual relations a year after making homosexuality a crime. The vote in the lower house this week has made the country one of the few in sub-Saharan Africa where same-sex relations is not illegal. Despite the official shift in position, some members of the country's LGBTQ community have said that they're still worried that they may face a homophobic backlash over the changes. Now, gay sex is illegal in most African countries. Botswana and Angola have decriminalized homosexuality, but many living in religiously conservative communities on the continent struggle with persecution and discrimination. Some LGBTQ people have sought asylum in Kenya, but even there, it's a struggle to find acceptance.
Martin Okello was persecuted as a gay man in Uganda. So he fled here to Kenya, the only African nation where someone can seek asylum and be registered as a refugee based on their LGBT status. But even in Kenya, he has been attacked.
There's no place that is safe. It's all about keeping a low profile rather than keeping high profile. And I was also recently beaten and attacked by the Kenyan homophobic people. They really hurt me and no one could actually engage themselves into the matter, the onlookers. So the situation was really very much worse. So I was beaten and left for dead.
Martin Okello hopes to be resettled in the United States. Currently, he lives in a shelter in Nairobi which welcomes people from the LGBT community. This one is led by Raymond Bryan, a Ugandan refugee who identifies as gender non-conforming.
Many of the people we have in our organization, they were neglected by families, by the community. So when they come in the house or at home, they feel at least they do something or they belong somewhere.
According to Human Rights Watch, 32 African nations have laws criminalizing homosexuality. Often the laws are left over from the colonial era. Even in Kenya, gay sex is illegal. Sodomy is punishable by up to 14 years in prison.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.